Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. An absolute pleasure to be able to speak to you today. How are you? Okay?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Maybe you could just kick off with a brief introduction to this film. For people who don't know anything about it, what can they expect?
So it is in us all. Basically, it's about a man in terms of plot. He's an English city man, probably that we're very familiar with, good-looking guy who has everything in his 40s, and he's from London, and he flies into Northern Ireland, Donegal Airport, and hires a car, and there's a tragic accident, and he's gone back to try and sign off on his a family home that's from his mother's heritage. And in that accident, he's sort of thrust into this world with a boy who's a local boy, and goes on this journey with that, and their entanglement of trauma and what that brings together. And actually what that brings is a profound sense of life and vitality. That's what happens narratively. What is it actually about, though?
Well, yeah, I think probably that's one of the first things that struck me, that in terms of kind of a storyline, even the dialogue, it feels quite stripped back, but there's so much complexity and nuance and so many layers, I think, to the film. So maybe you could just start by saying, what was your starting point for the film, and why were you compelled to tell the story in this very specific way?
There was a combination of factors, just the sort of things that fascinate me across the board and always have done in my work. The things that excite me and really move me, which tends to be, I'm moved by a lot of photography. There's a lot of photographers I was really interested in, and it's sort of my life as well, in a sense. So, but I'm really interested in films that I don't see as often. I wanted to make something that I felt was very unique to the way I see the world. And so I keep saying to people that it is science fiction in a pastoral setting, because we associate science fiction with like aliens and stuff like that, but I think it's much more tonality, and it is a man descending into a completely untouched land. There's like being submerged underwater, and that's effectively what this place feels like. I mean, it is a landscape in a part of Northern Ireland, or Donegal, the northern tip of Ireland, where I was born, and we left when I was 2 years old, and I would revisit as an adult. And that feeling of coming back to a place that is of your heritage, but sort of unknown, was quite profound and deep and weighted. And I would do these drives from Belfast Airport to Donegal, and nothing moves me more than that landscape and the journey across. And you do feel like you're descending into a place that is like Mars. And at the time, there was this constant hearsay and speak amongst this very disparate community of these young boys that were driving cars and being killed. But it was like this hushed approach to the way people dialogue amongst each other. And that's something that I recognize in all kinds of very sparse communities, in rural places. You see it in mining towns in America and Serbia, all these, and it could be set in any of these places. But what I also see in these communities and with these children, effectively, is how raw and true and emotionally bold and brave and selfless they are. And that's because there's a freedom that comes where they haven't yet developed, and the brain has not learned consequence. So the amygdala starts to release testosterone when they're going through puberty. And that's why young kids, boys, they'll fight and play and jump off walls, and they test danger. And then the rest of the brain develops, and then they learn consequence. So when you're dealing with a man like Hamish, the protagonist, he's like someone who's never experienced that freedom and with that essence of life. And so in the process of the film, it's like life begins to bleed out of him in spurts. And it's like he's been shot with a gun, and that is when he comes to be.
And I think what's interesting is, obviously there's lots of films that kind of deal with, let's say, kind of toxic masculinity, or kind of embedded patriarchy, which can very much come from society, as well as, kind of within families and within communities.
Yep.
But it's through kind of a sensitive lens. So we actually have sympathy for Hamish, even though, at the off, he can seem very kind of cold, and maybe sort of that stereotype of kind of being this very, very closed off, maybe there's kind of like pent up aggression there, but you're kind of wanting him to break through. You're wanting him to discover another side to himself. So I think it's a really interesting lens that you've taken on some of those issues.
Okay, great. I mean, I'm glad you say that, because Hamish is someone I know, I'm sure you know, and I thought it was very interesting to try and draw this man that I'm so familiar with. And I often, we see them in affluent cities everywhere. And I really feel for these men, because I think it's such a terrible shame that underneath the exterior of the external perfection and affluence, and I would call them an excellent man, that is so precise and has to better themselves constantly. There's such a lack of freedom and such a lack of feeling in that. And I really wanted to show a man that we quite immediately begin to find some compassion for, and that's what's so important about his father and how his father's depicted, and all done through phone calls. But that is someone who's never, I don't want to say, it's not only that he's never been loved, he's never been seen. And to not be seen is like the greatest aggression that you can have on any human being, regardless. And you have to, it's a challenge to an audience. Like, I'm drawing characters that don't have handles on them for an audience to hold on to. We really have to be pushed to that extremity to go the pace with them and earn a feeling of compassion for that character.
And maybe you could talk a little bit about casting Cosmo Jarvis, because I feel like, he really stood out going back to, with Florence Pugh in Lady Macbeth. Yeah. But he's done quite a range of roles since, and I feel like probably he's not been typecast necessarily, but he's normally very much kind of the brawn, he's this kind of rough and ready type character. So it was quite interesting to see him kind of more in this sort of, like you say, affluent businessman role, but still with that kind of physicality that he brings to all his parts. So what was it like casting him? And then, of course, the sort of contrasting young lads that he meets in Donegal.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's really interesting to, I love an actor who goes against type. I really loved as soon as I met Cosmo, because I knew him before a bit, but and of course the Calm with Horses conversations came up, like, oh, Irish. And I'm like, well, I'm not showing Ireland in the way that we've seen it before. And there are so many incredible actors around who have craft, but they were the man or a version of the man that I know, very well-educated men, and Cosmo's very well-educated, but I love the idea of trying to refine an actor rather than a lot of actors rough up, to put it in very plain man speak. And I like the idea of him completely changing his physicality to try and push towards an elegance and a grace. So I sent Cosmo lots of videos of men who do skin regimes and things like this. Showed him lots of ballet dancers. So what there is with that is such a pride in men who have such pride in their physique, but there's a real self-care with it, and a self-consciousness. And that's what I think Cosmo has very much mastered, put a lot of work into it. And he's very different to, I think, how anybody has ever seen him before.
Definitely. And it also feels like the locations are really crucial. So kind of the landscapes of Ireland, but even when he goes into his aunt's house, he's expecting to be, dilapidated, and actually it's in very good condition. And it feels like he has kind of, that's when the self-doubt starts to creep in as well, of, hang on, this is a whole world that I'm drawn to and I don't know anything about, and I'm not sure I want to let go of it. So how important were the locations?
The locations were first, actually. That's kind of how I work. I write places that I know and have seen and have moved me in some way. And there was no way that I could shoot anywhere but there, because that is the story. It is the energy from this landscape that I feel is so much a leading role and character in this film. And the house was also very integral, because I wanted to go against any stereotype that we have that is depicted in film about Ireland. And because it very much had to be so that this film could have been shot on Mars, it could have been shot in Romania, it could have been anywhere. It is about a feeling of a landscape. And the house had to look as though it was dropped, that it is a beacon, it's like a mothership. And when I found that house, that was it. And it was very hard to keep that house. And then the interior, we built as a set, it was a stage set. And that's, again, in order to create a sort of feeling for the audience across the board. It's to give that sort of disjointed, disparate feeling where you go into the house and it is a different, the air changes. And that was very important. And to have those stage sets very precise, and every piece of furniture was considered so that we understand the woman that his aunt was and the connection that he would have come from. It's an unknowing, and then piecing together, and he starts to fill. His innards start to become, he starts to know himself.
And what do you hope that people will take away from watching the film? Because it's very immersive, and how do you hope people kind of come out the other side of it feeling?
The reason of the title, It Is in Us All, is I really want people to reflect. Would love for an audience to park judgment and just allow it to wash, because that is sort of how it's designed. You get an impression of the man in the beginning, and then you need to go into that world with him and to experience it with him, because ultimately the journey of Hamish is to open. He breaks open and he starts to feel and to live, and moments of vitality and wonder and beauty touch him for the first time ever. And that is what that journey is. And I find that, I'm not going to spoil it or anything, but ultimately the end is meant to be it's a release. It is an opening. And I hope that people will receive that experience.
I think I'm out of time, but just very quickly, I mean, I know the film's showing at South by Southwest, so how you feel about that, but also without it being International Women's Day, I would probably feel like I should mention something about, how do you see the landscape out there for female filmmakers? It feels like, things are leveling up. There's lots more opportunities, but maybe still a way to go. But it feels like people are realizing more and more that we have a much more rich cinema industry with more diverse filmmakers.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, from the outset of my career, I've always worked with seemingly very strong women. I've been very lucky and fortunate to have that experience. And what's very, very important to me is, because this was a female filmmakers fund, FFF, but what I felt was important was to almost put a female lens on the male, because I do think it's very much, I think you can see in the piece that it is from a female gaze, a woman's gaze. And that doesn't have to, I think people sometimes are frightened by the word because they associate with the stereotype, but women can be bold and they can be dangerous and probing. And that is very much what I want to show. There is a wealth of extremely talented women out there, and they're just, the 50-50 parity has to be a constant. There needs to be a landscape where we're not conscious of having to address the 50-50. Yeah.
And I guess, like not feeling confined as well to telling what might be stereotypical women's stories, but actually it's the female lens to any kind of experience and any kind of story.
Exactly. I mean, that's why when I say this is sort of my story, but I wrote it as a male, because I think it's interchangeable. I think there is, not to say that gender is not relevant. Gender is very relevant, but it's also irrelevant in a sense, and that's another conversation for another day, especially as it's Women's Day. But I do feel that we shouldn't be able to recognize a piece of work by its gender and by the gender of the person who made it. The work should stand alone on itself.
that seems like a brilliant place to stop. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was lovely to speak to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.